Yeah.
Wow, that's quite an accomplishment.
Yeah.
then.
Hi, Charlie. Hi, Glenn.
Hey, Darren, how are you?
Hey, Deborah.
Almost on time? No.
You are almost on time.
Here we go.
That's good enough.
Time is my worst thing.
Would it be helpful to have a discussion of Article 1 and the definitions before you? Who's doing the rewrite of Article 1?
I guess I would take a
I was thinking, I'm looking at you, Tom, because I thought it was you, but you were looking kind of like, what?
Like a complete rewrite, right?
No, I think it's just,
Updating the ones that needed to be done.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. My printer is
and I'm just
actually
thinking confirming
having some
which
issues.
definitions or areas we think need to be.
And you
Well, there's a
can
lot-
call me to order now.
What?
You can call me to order now.
Okay. Okay, we will call this meeting to order. Joe, can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
Great. Today, what we want to accomplish is, we left off our last meeting having not completed going through the lighting section. And I think we want to complete that, go back and take a quick look at the definitions in Article 1 so we can identify any areas that we think should be focused on, because we've discussed just having, I say, fairly minor changes to there, things that we thought needed to be tweaked or updated, open spaces being one of the main ones. And then we also have, was distributed from Tom, was I'm sorry, was it Charlie or Tom who distributed the checklist? Tom. Okay. The updated requirements checklist, and we want to go through those in detail. Now, we have a hard stop at 11:30 today. So I want to stop at about 11:15 and plan, really look at a little bit of more long-range plans in terms of dates. Because if we plan to have a public meeting, I think we need to start thinking about the date for that and working backwards to make sure we have all of the materials required to have a successful public meeting. So I would suggest that we continue where we left off, which is with lighting, and that is on page 7 of a document that's dated July 15th. Does everyone have that? It's the document that has the list of the categories and schedule on the front of it, that some things were highlighted in yellow. Are you with us, Joe? So, Tom, do you want to take us through that?
Sure. So, a couple of caveats. When I wrote this section and a couple others, it's changed a lot over the years. If you look in our current ordinance, maybe there's a couple paragraphs about lighting. But it is important, and I know when we do a development plan, we ask for a lighting plan more and more. So when I looked at it, I tried to go out and look at this one and probably a couple others too. What other communities are doing that's very current and based on research that's out there. And that's what this represents. It's from some model ordinance language that's been put out there by communities that are concerned about lighting and its effect as it's changed with new technology. The caveat is I've put a lot in here, and there's always a balancing act with how detailed we get and how well can it be administered. And this is one of those things with luminaires and other things. It's difficult for volunteers to understand some of these things during a meeting. It's, for the building officials, do they have the wherewithal to do those things? So I'm going to walk us through some of the purposes and what it's about, but with that in mind, I'm really open to and inviting people to say, this doesn't work here, or this does work. And that's kind of this one and probably a couple other of the standard sections.
Tom, can I ask a question about definitions before we begin? when you're talking about the glare, which is referred to a lot, are we talking about the night sky component, or are we incorporating, how can we best incorporate the night sky? Because I know that's something that is a concern, I guess, to some residents in Lewis.
Yeah, so glare here, it's used generally, it could be glare up, where it could be glare on someone's property that's adjacent to them. And I think, and I'll look at it, it refers to standards for lighting that are out there, and night sky is a big one. But that's something that we can call out more if it's not clear enough, because it is something that it's important, and it's a newer thing. There's standards that meet that, so we have to take that into consideration.
And do we have, good precedent for other municipalities addressing the night sky now?
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah, a lot do. It's an important one, especially at their character. They don't want to see the
Absolutely.
sky lit up.
I think that would be of our character.
Yeah.
I don't know if how others feel on that.
And I
In
was
general,
just
of course.
realizing, Tom, you sent out an article.
And I meant to resend
and
that because
I'm not sure that, I think that may have been sent out before you joined.
Yeah, I don't recall getting an article about that.
So we should, if we can forward that to Deborah.
That would be great.
Because it kind of went through what other municipalities have been thinking about.
Oh, fantastic.
And how they're looking at, and the night sky was an important part of that.
Great.
the other thing to mention too, and Charlie will chime in on this, is that it talks about street lighting in here. Well, Lewis is unique that we have the Board of Public Works that has standards for street lighting, and they own, they control a lot of the street lighting. So what we do here, we'll have to run through Charlie and through Austin and others. Does this work, or is there conflicts in what this is saying? I'm trying to deal with it from a planning standpoint, but also understanding that there's other agencies that are involved in it.
The other thing I'd like us to think about a little bit, because after we finish this section, we'll be looking at the checklist, is when I went through the checklist, a couple places when it just mentions lighting, I wasn't sure whether the checklist is referencing the kinds of information that I think the revised lighting section
Right.
focuses on.
That's
So-
similar to the definitions. There's
Yeah.
definitions that aren't, there's terms that are used in here that need to be in the definitions section,
Right.
so it's clear. And the checklist. The other thing, and it was in that article that I sent around that Deborah hasn't seen yet,
Sorry, Deborah.
that's kind of new with technology is, and you've probably seen it in your street lighting, is LED lights have replaced the older lights. So LED lights are great for energy efficiency, and it cuts down on maintenance and also the operation. Some communities are finding, though, that it gets into I forget what the term is, the color of it. If it's too white, it's somewhat disturbing to others. And when it first started rolling out, it was just the basic white lights. And we've seen that. I don't know, when you go buy lights for your house, you could get white or you could get soft white. And that's the difference. So it's something of an aesthetic, but as you'll see here or in that article, it also affects wildlife and others because it's not natural.
Yeah.
And it can have impacts, especially in sensitive areas.
So does that mean that we possibly want to, really define this, towards amber?
Yeah, it talks about the color, it can't be below us or above a certain amount. Have you been familiar with this or come across it in the community?
Well, the only thing I would say is that typically on subdivisions, the developer, engineer, typically on subdivisions, the developer's engineer, the electrical engineer will do a whole analysis, which is, you allude to it in here, Tom, and they determine, what the spread of whatever particular light there is and how the development will be covered by lights the way it's supposed to be covered.
So I would only say with regard to the soft white versus white discussion that
I'd have to check with electrical engineers, but it might affect the number of light standards that are required in the development, because it might just be a little lighter light that doesn't cover as much ground.
But typically, what you really see in a lot of ordinances is that it's shielded and downward screened. And then there's some type of foot candle or luminary standard about that. So it's not going up, it's coming down, and then it's also not going into the houses. Because I know right now there's 5 pages of lighting standards, which I'm going to tell you is a little too much. And I think, and because again, Tom said he just threw everything in there to see kind of what stuck. And I think we can, address it without this kind of level of detail. I mean, because I think we definitely need some detail, but I think there's ways we can address it, because we definitely want it, shielded, downward screened. We can talk about foot candles or luminaries, which are, and, even height of things, because you don't want, especially for residential, you don't want, a really tall light pole, but we'd want to double check with BPW to make sure there's no conflicts.
And my apologies, it's page 6 we're beginning on, not page 7. Okay.
So I'm going to go through the sections and describe what's in there and what it's about. So on page 6, it talks about the intent, like we've done with all these standards. This is the purpose statement, if for one of other terms, of what the Planning Commission would look at to meet why are all these standards and guidelines in here. So its lighting guidelines are intended to eliminate adverse impacts of light spillover, to provide attractive lighting fixtures and layout patterns that contribute to unified exterior lighting designs, and encourage energy efficiency, as well as provide exterior lighting that promotes safe vehicular and pedestrian access to and within developments while minimizing impacts on adjacent properties and the nighttime sky. So that covers a lot of, I think, what we just talked about, of energy efficiency and attractiveness and safety. It's really a balancing act with a lot of those. The applicability section is talking about where these things apply or don't apply. So it doesn't apply to holiday lighting, and it doesn't apply to, what are some of the other things? So temporary, seasonal, or events, I believe it won't apply to.
Yeah, I didn't see events covered there. I made a comment of, I don't know, weddings, fundraising events, things where you may have additional lighting, or, a fair that's on a lot.
So is that something you'd like to see in there? We have to decide what it would be.
Yeah.
I may have to recuse on this, but I would propose perhaps during December having some leniency, I don't know, with Christmas lights.
Yeah, well, right
Okay,
now,
good.
a holiday, seasonal decorative lighting is exempted, so I think that
Yep,
would cover,
there we go.
that would cover Christmas. But I'm thinking more of things that aren't seasonal, but maybe event-based.
Right, I'm thinking if things are, and I'm going to look to Glenn, you can tell me if I'm wrong. If something is event-based and not something that's development-based that's going to be there, it might be better to make a recommendation that the city put it in the event section of the code, because
Okay.
my concern with having it in here is when somebody applies for an event
not looking there.
permit, it's
Yeah.
not.
Yeah.
It's-
Okay.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, we're
Yeah, good
looking at
point.
subdivision here and not
Yeah.
events.
Other things are like an emergency, if that happens, storms, things like that people need to put tall lights up, or other things. So those are, I hope, obvious that, we wouldn't apply these other standards to it. But anything else, uses or structures that are in the city have to comply with these things if they're going through. And as Anne Marie said, this is the development process. These standards are to be there to have, for major subdivisions and even minor subdivisions and site plans, to have standards that are consistent across the board. I do know that some of the recent developments, it was a big concern for the city, but we, it said you had to have a lighting plan, and it gave some idea of the poles, where they're at, and height, but not really some of these other things. And again, with new technology, it's important sometimes in a residential area as opposed to an industrial area that these things are up to date and consistent. So the next part, if you don't have any questions on applicability,
I would just like it to say, if it's a site plan, that's got to go to the Joint Site Development Ad Hoc Review Committee. Because sometimes if you're just doing a small addition, it doesn't make sense to have to go through the full requirement. Like if you're doing a 200 square foot addition to a commercial structure, or you're redoing the layout of something that just requires administrative site plan review.
well, wouldn't that, this is for subdivisions.
No, you put site plans in here.
Oh, okay, so I'm trying to understand the distinction. So under site plan, it would be in there if it qualifies as a site plan, so you have to have a certain amount of square footage to be a...
So
Saying if it's an administrative site plan, you don't want to get into that level of
detail.
Okay, I'm sorry.
It's only if it has to go to the Joint Site Development Ad Hoc Review Committee.
I understand that.
Okay, cool.
Thanks. So, standards for all uses. B is the illumination levels that we talked about and the standards, the IES lighting handbook work. So there's two. Were recommended practices of the Illuminating Engineering Society of North America. These are guidelines that are out there that are maintained separately with standards.
I want to go back to A,
Yeah, I have a quick comment on that,
because A, I don't know how it's, to me, it reads more of an intent, because I don't know how we would enforce special consideration shall be given to minimizing any adverse impact of proposed lighting plan on residents and wildlife. To me, it's more of an intent, because again, that's what we don't want to do, is have an adverse impact.
So should we just state it stronger? I mean, should it just, because I think this is important.
Yeah, I'd have to look at how it's been worded. I mean, I've lived in an area where this actually, especially on wildlife, was a specific concern for, yep, and it was, the directionality of the light, that if it's in a path of migration. And I actually questioned, because also once lived where you're in a flight plan and where upward lighting, especially that could have an impact on aircraft. And I was thinking of BB helicopters and things like that. I don't know whether we ever have that situation or not. But
Yeah, I'm just thinking, if it's a standard, I don't know what the standard
I
is.
see.
It reads as an intent.
Okay.
There's no I can't implement anything
Yeah.
when you're reviewing a plan. That's why I'm more concerned about that.
So the question is, what would the standard be that it could be
Yes.
measured against? Yes.
It sort of reminds me, okay, Deborah.
Oh, I'm sorry, I'm just thinking it reverts back to what you brought up earlier about the downward lighting. So how can we just state that?
Well, I think there's two different things here in my mind. The resident part of it will be a lot of places. The wildlife part of it, it sort of reminds me of the historical artifacts and things that you run into through the State Plus group, where if they think there's artifacts in an area, they require a report. It seems like we could, if we wanted to, be pretty tough on developers, and if we think there's some sort of wildlife issue where lighting might affect the wildlife, that we would require some sort of report. But it kind of reminds me of that, but the residence part of it is probably more
Yeah, I think we
ubiquitous.
can get into this, and back to Deborah, is like the downward screening, the downward, and then it being shielded, and then I think if we get into the luminaries and the light and the foot candles, I think this gets addressed.
I think it gets addressed for the residents. I'm not sure. And we might want to, especially because we are a neighbor to state parkland and state natural areas, we may want to consult with DENREC to say, you know, what are there specific standards that you would want if something's adjacent to or within a certain distance of a state park, nature preserve, or wildlife area?
Where I've seen this used is where there's out of the natural area inventory, when there's a sensitive habitat area.
Right.
So in Lewis, that's along the canal. So it extends from the state park and, around that area and down through the canal. And I know that is a concern along there of people have lights that are there, and is it impacting? It depends on I'm not a lighting scientist. It depends on, I think, someone who's more knowledgeable in that. But Charlie brought up maybe reports are needed.
Right.
And maybe we put those in guidelines, because we put it in the intent, and then again, we want everything shielded and in a lower intensity. And then when we get to, something near a state park or parklands, then we have those guidelines that we can place as a condition on the application.
Would it be guidelines or to ask for a report? Because I'm not.
I'm a little concerned about asking for a report, because who has the background to review that? But I think if we have some guidelines that we reach out to the state and get guidance on and put them guidelines on, and then we can make those conditions of an application.
Okay.
I think that handles
I think
everybody's kind of concerns.
if we were to reach out to Karen Bennett, who works at State Parks and oversees the Natural Areas Program, one, she's going to know, it may not be the same thing for each thing. If there's a protected species, for instance, and they're adversely affected by light, we might treat that differently than if it's near a part of the park where you're hunting.
Yeah.
So, and Karen would be the person who would be able to help us kind of outline based on the resources that are here on the Cape. For instance, the piping plover is so protected, right? I don't know if there are light issues or not. Osprey, another one. If you're near an osprey nest, and that osprey nest can be on top of a power pole, but there's still a level of protection that's afforded to certain species. So it may be species related, or it could be the land related. And Karen is very knowledgeable of that, and she used to live in the park, so.
I do think this is a really good idea to look into and define, because as we get into annexation, unrelated topic, but North Road, New Road and North, I can tell you that we have a lot of unusual birds that migrate through, and a lot of wildlife up there, surprising amounts. And the areas, that are going to be developed someday or under consideration are the areas along the Canary Creek, and who knows if they'll be part of Lewis. I think we need to be pretty vigilant on this particular area and keep wildlife in there, but maybe not right here.
Yeah, so I think we have as an action to contact Karen, perhaps even look at other jurisdictions to see how they've handled this, so that we can have a standard that is enforceable and guidelines that make sense. So who owns that action?
Tom and I will work that out.
Okay, good.
Yeah, I wrote it down too.
Do you guys know Karen?
I don't, but
I can make the introduction. I've known her for
okay.
a long, long time.
We won't ask how many years.
Just a couple of years.
So her husband was the nature center manager at Cape Henlopen State Park for many years. So I've known them since the 90s when I worked for State Park, so.
I remember a couple years ago, this was a big issue with Cape Henlopen Drive,
Yes.
where the lighting was to be improved
Right?
there. And I don't,
When there was discussion of the pedestrian lighting.
Yeah.
right.
And yes,
So I don't know how we resolved that or what we looked at, or, but that's the similar
Yes.
situation, I think.
Yeah.
It dropped off the radar, so it resolved itself. But it was, you had, and, you know, sometimes, I think having the people who are most knowledgeable about what's needed to protect the resource.
And who've been involved in resolving this in the
Right.
past is a good idea. Okay, so let's carry on and,
So I wrote down that what I'll do is I'll look at the intent, this is more of an intent statement, but the guidelines would be important for wildlife to have, how we're addressing that, and what's the approach if we get into that. So I think it does make sense to reach out to Karen and get her insights on it. I do think we can get more specific about what areas we,
Yeah, I think that can be the standard, and then the guidelines is how do we deal with it? Because
Yeah.
we don't need all of those in code, because
yeah.
I don't want to overwhelm and confuse people thinking that they have to comply, and that's why we're doing the whole standards, and then the guidelines will be a separate document.
And it may be different depending on what the resource is.
Oh, yeah, so,
Okay.
so then next, this is all under luminaire design, and it is kind of what we've been talking about, and some of it I understand, some of it, the ratings and things. When I read that article that I sent around, I understood it, and I can't recall it all now, but it seems important. They're breaking it down into horizontal surfaces and non-horizontal or vertical surfaces. The difference being like a parking lot or a big area that's set aside, or areas in the city versus facades of buildings and things, and how the designs of the lighting for that should be different. It talks about the standards in here, the bug rating of U equals 0 luminaires with an aggregate lamp output not exceeding 500 lumens, the rated output of a standard non-directional 40-watt incandescent or 10-watt compact fluorescent light. So they're saying that these are standards that when a lighting plan comes in, there's something to base it on. The bug rating, and I can't describe it, I should have looked it up again. I understood it a month ago when I wrote this. It is something that, it's about the glare. It's measuring the glare. That's what the G is in that. It has to be 0 when it's at certain places.
Would this be worth Charlie having RMF look at? Just because, to me, when you read that, it was like I was in a Peanuts episode and the parents are talking.
even my notes are like, how do we make this simpler? Because staff's got to be able to understand it, we've got to be able to enforce it, and then we have to be able to explain it to the public. So if we have like a standard, this is what it is, and then maybe those specifics go into the guidelines.
Right. And my guess is RMF will be able to look at this and know exactly what it means and might be able to
Turn it into
something
Planners.
that our staff will be able to understand.
Yeah, I think they are the ones to answer it, but, somebody like them, at first I kind of liked it because it sort of identified what the luminaires needed to be, and then they would use that for their design purposes to determine how many lights were required throughout the development. But like you guys were talking about, if we just refer to a standard, maybe we don't have to have all this detail in there.
Well, though anybody is a lighting, it seems that the person who would be putting this in would be a lighting designer, so they should
know it.
They should know this.
They should know it, but
Whether we can,
we need to be able
yes.
to understand it, explain it to you guys, explain it to the public, explain it to the applicant.
What's the process now, Charlie, for when a subdivision plan comes in, and does the streetlight design, I should know this, but I don't, does the streetlight design and layout get reviewed, or do we just assume that because it's developed,
Because again, it's going through BPW.
right, but they're not,
Yeah.
I don't think there's anything in the code right now, correct me if I'm wrong,
Okay.
that requires it. We,
Okay.
GMB requires it typically, like when we did Waterfront Preserve, we required it. And it comes back with a plan that shows you
Yeah,
the
we're,
coverage of the
And
lights.
do you
Yeah.
have people who are able to read that and know what it means? I'm just saying,
Even I
I
can read it and
wouldn't.
know what it means, but
yeah, me too.
but it's not, it's not,
Making sure this meets.
I'm not that comfortable saying it's good because it is just a plan with like coverage areas on it. So
And numbers going
Yeah.
out or in.
I feel like
Well, in some ways, it would be like taking the stormwater plan developed by the engineer and saying, yeah, looks good. And you guys do a little more.
what happens,
A little more.
like pump stations are a good example, where GMB knows all about the mechanical parts
Right.
of it. But when it comes to the electrical and the electrical controls, we hire a RMF to
Right.
review the plans, and
Right.
they're like, that bill gets passed on to the developer. But I don't think that we've ever done it on street lighting before like that, hiring a
I
subconsultant.
don't think this is insurmountable. I have to say, I'm a bit like you, Tom. When I read the original article, I looked up a bunch of things and read definitions, and I thought I had a good handle on it, okay? And now a lot of it's been forgotten. But, if you were reviewing this on a regular basis, that would stick with you and you would understand it. But I think you're right, we need to speak to someone, and if RMF you think is the right source we should go to.
Well, then BW probably
Yeah.
wants to have some say on
Yeah.
it too, since they're involved.
Well, they should definitely have say.
Yeah.
I mean, definitely, we want to include them in the discussion, but in terms of knowing if technically we're describing it right, if it's going to be
Enforceable.
enforceable,
If it's the right standard, yeah. I mean, because again, I prefer this be broader and again, just a little bit easier to be able to explain.
I can't see.
He's talking about something that's been coordinated with street trees. Joe, you can unmute and
Joe, could you unmute, because we
Come on.
we couldn't read your note, okay? We're looking at a very fuzzy.
He says that the street trees and lighting plans have been coordinated to avoid conflicts.
Right.
yeah, we'll do
And
that.
that's definitely within the planner's skill set.
Absolutely.
But knowing if you have the proper foot candles or luminaries or,
I mean, I can read a lighting plan and, know that it's not going off another property, but to make sure it's complying with this, that's not in my skill set. That's actually a very specific skill set, so again, if we can bring it back and.
Yeah, and I think that that's what we have to decide, what's the balance? Because when I was doing some recent site plans, it wasn't the street lighting, it was the parking lot lighting. Or even a store that's adjacent to residential areas, and if they have a 40-foot tall basic white light, the glare is going out, and, that's where it becomes a problem. I know when the elementary school was approved, that, there was concern about where will the lighting be, and how will that be affecting our adjacent residential areas?
we've had the same discussions, Charlie, on the plans you've been working on to redo the beach parking lot lighting. And, again, there's a real sensitivity in this community, and especially as you get to the beaches and the more undeveloped areas, there's a real sensitivity to light pollution. And
maybe in those areas, maybe it's not the tall one, it's the lower to the ground one.
Right.
And I think we put all of those in the guidelines, so as an application comes in, again, like we've been talking about, what's appropriate for this application? So the condition goes with that, but we have the broader kind of, this is what it is.
Yeah, I agree. There's a balancing here between setting a baseline that people have to meet, which can be complicated, and then conveying that for a planner or someone who's saying, what does this mean?
Right, and is that the correct baseline for every development?
Right, yeah.
Yeah,
And that's
so
what
I
this
think-
does differentiate in the
Yeah.
color temperature and all between a residential and a commercial
Yeah.
area. Because it's sometimes more expensive to do it with less light pollution than tall lights. And you don't really need to do that in some areas, but other areas it's important.
I'm sorry to ask a kind of off-task question, but how can we apply this over towards minor subdivisions as well? You know, like, as we get into taller buildings, particularly on the beach, and a lot of times weekend owners will have security, you know, motion lighting.
Oh, yikes. That's a good question.
Really, if we're having a full-height building in a neighborhood of cottages.
So that would be a larger lighting issue that's not part of a subdivision, because you're
Talking about lighting on your personal house?
I think that would be more either in zoning or in a separate section
Section of
of code.
Yes.
We did create an environmental section, and there could be something there. In some ways, it makes sense if it's going to be if you're regulating something on the individual residential properties, to put it in zoning so that it doesn't fall off and...
For example, and I don't want to go far on this, but if we can all kind of put that in the back of our minds, that maybe something as simple as your lights would be mounted no higher than the, you know, neighboring homes.
Yeah,
As opposed to
I
at the
suggest
top of.
that we, you know, at the beginning of last year, the LPC had an action subcommittee that went through, you know, basically creating this long list of all of the things that have come up that we think we need to look at or act on. And so in part, this work on the subdivision code came out of that action list. But this sounds like an item we should be recording so that when we go through an action list again, we've captured it and figure out kind of which group where, how it can get addressed.
Yeah.
So that we don't lose these things. And you know, one of the reasons of doing the whole action planning was to kind of capture all of the things and start trying to go through that list and work on all of them. So
You know, I think realistically, some people go and redesign their house and think, how is this going to impact my neighbors?
Yeah.
And then others, it does not occur to at all.
Yeah.
So,
Right.
So
Yeah.
end of that, sorry.
I'm
Joe, are you
writing it down on.
I'm going to try to get
No, it's,
Joe, were you trying to say
Something? Okay, it just sounded like,
thought I heard some static.
yeah, we thought you might have been trying to say something, so we wanted to make sure.
ruffling papers, who knows?
And I'm thinking, actually, since we have an environmental section, maybe that's where some of this lighting stuff actually goes. Out of a subdivision and into that section, because that seems to be maybe a more appropriate, well, having some of the standards here, but, I don't know, it's just an idea.
I think this is great work that's been done, and, you know, we're doing it here when we're talking about subdivisions, but we're really talking about something that probably we need to think of more broadly. And whether more of the detail belongs in another section.
Yeah, Tom and I'll talk about that.
Okay.
Because I even got like, I think it looked like Glenn was like,
Yeah, I mean, it's tough because, you'll capture the new subdivisions with this, but it really is a theme that you want throughout the city then on lighting.
Right, what I think Janelle and I have both taken to heart very much recently is that the vast majority of the development that we're seeing in Lewis is stuff that doesn't rise to the level of subdivision, site plan. It's scraping houses and putting something much different than what was there back. And the subdivision ordinance isn't going to catch that, even even to the degree that it addresses minor subdivisions. It's not, the minor subdivision is really about where the lot line is because you're not building infrastructure. So the lighting standards, I think if you try to put it in here, wanting to catch minor subdivisions and individual lot developments, it's not going to catch it. Am I right?
That's exactly right, yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. I mean, the tear down rebuilds, you never look at the subdivision code.
right? Yeah, so maybe we take a good chunk of this out and add it to the environmental section and reference
or we keep it in, but we need to figure out where to get to the root of this.
So-
What do we need to do?
Because you might still want to keep it in.
Well, no,
for
that's
your-
why I was gonna, like, you put it in the environmental section and you reference.
Right, okay.
So it's not in both.
Yeah.
So you don't duplicate code, because I think we need to finish going through this.
Yeah, exactly.
We haven't even made it a full page.
Yeah, that's why I was like, let's leave it at time one.
Sorry if I'm-
Is the environmental section the part of the zoning ordinance?
Yeah, so the Chapter 95 is titled Environmental Protection. It's got things like gasoline-powered landscaping equipment, littering, outdoor smoking, and so it's a new chapter that's supposed to capture
So-
these sorts of...
Right.
Yeah.
Because a lot of these things, any standard that you put in there is helpful, but it could be unintended, and you want to waive certain things, which is why it's good to have it in the subdivision ordinance. That's why I was asking about zoning. So it's not zoning, which would...
But the other,
If it's referenced here, because it's referenced here, they can still
right.
Yeah, I was just concerned if it were, the environmental was in zoning, then it would be a lot.
So, but there's two.
Well, no, 'cause it's
there's
chapter
two
95.
Pieces in my view, there's two pieces to the illumination. One part of it is clearly the environmental section. So there's the minimum and the maximum, right? So you've got your minimum that you want for safety. So that's making sure that you don't have unlit parking lots where people are gonna, become victims of crime or whatever. So you have, or unlit streets where, people aren't comfortable walking at night because, so there's you have a minimum standard that's in the interest of public safety. But the maximum standard is where you're trying to balance that public safety element that's needed with not having external effects that are damaging to the neighborhood, to the environment, to the wildlife.
To the night sky, to the wildlife, to all those things, yeah. So, I think it's worthwhile for us to continue this work, because it'll be the first time that anyone's really dug into lighting to this degree. And then we can figure out exactly which pieces should go where.
Okay.
So why don't we carry on, and let's try to get through lighting please today.
Okay. So that under under luminaire design, the next thing is color temperature. And this gets into what I talked about with LED lights. That's where it became a big issue of, and the measurement, you're seeing it there. There's one for industrial commercial districts, and then one, which is a lower one, for residential districts. So the idea is that you're not having really bright white lights in residential areas, and it's not as big of an issue in industrial areas. The next section is lighting controls. These are a bunch, they're somewhat standards, but they're trying to they're somewhat aspirations or intents, but they're putting a standard behind it. So the first one is about hazards to drivers, and where, making it a concern, so illumination's not shining directly in their, in ways that's going to cause problems.
And I just had a quick question on that, whether drivers includes bicyclists, because we have a lot of bicyclists. I just wasn't sure whether we needed to add that.
Yeah, it says drivers or pedestrians. We could add bicyclists.
I would add bicycles,
Yeah.
because that is,
A growing.
I know, exactly, yeah.
and I think what we can do is actually reference the
Belga lighting standards. They've got lighting guidelines that they use, and I'm gonna guess they cover a lot of stuff as well, because it is a 38-page report. So I'm guessing they've got a lot of standards, and I think maybe that's where we go look at them and kind of take a look. So I want to actually throw something out there. Should we put like a halt on the lighting standards, take a look at what the DELDOT is, kind of see what fits, and then rework this and then bring it back? Or do you want to keep going through it and, because,
I'd like us to at least
Okay.
go through this and get the feedback from this group.
okay, I'm just making sure.
First of all, I had looked quickly at DELDOT, and DELDOT is
Much more about streets and roads.
Yes.
And this really is, I think, trying to address something a bit different in terms of light leakage into, neighboring areas, et cetera.
But I think what we need to realize is lighting for a subdivision is going to be the street lights. It's not the house lights, so it's going to be the street lights. And then we're looking at commercial.
Yeah.
So you've got those two categories. And so I just,
So let's try to move through more quickly and get feedback from this group, and then you can go off, look at Del Dot, pull all of this together for the revision.
The next part is about floodlights and spotlights, directional illuminators onto neighboring residences, adjacent uses past the object being illuminated. It's talking about the design, so the direction of the light and how it's covered for this, so it's standards for curbing that or limiting it. The number 3 is for signs, billboards, building facades, and other surrounding landscapes. And it's starting to get into the time of day that they can be illuminated, so they can't be illuminated 24 hours a day in certain cases, starting off with this one.
I was confused by the reference to closing, whether there's a definition of closing.
There was discussion in some of the guidelines I saw on this, because employees stay around and are closing up and
I'm
things
thinking
like
of
that.
restaurants where, you may close to people entering the restaurant, and then, a small staff stays and closes the business in
Yeah.
terms of cleaning up, and, they need to get to their cars, and,
That's why it has to within no more than 1/2 hour after closing, but that's the intent of that, but it could be extended or saying to, it's hard if we did it for each business has its own closing times, but it's setting up the standard. This other one it's barn lights, and it's referring to where lights do need to be on at all times, from dusk to dawn. And they have to be, given, the city has to look at it and say, what's the justification for it? And especially in residential areas.
I feel like 2, 3, and 4 are along the lines of what you were saying, Nancy, maybe not necessarily related to streets, they're things
Yeah.
on houses and,
Businesses and,
yeah.
yeah. So maybe we take them and move them to guidelines and see what's appropriate for each.
I thought these were pretty specific and not guidelines, really. I mean, half hour of closing is,
are guidelines just recommendations, or are they?
There are items that it can be placed as a condition
Okay.
and then be like a standard.
So they're enforceable. I was
Yes.
kind of like you, is maybe they weren't enforceable, but it sounds like they are.
No, if it's, not all of them are
Yeah.
going to apply to like everything. So that's what I was just thinking. It's like,
But if they don't apply, they won't be in the plan, so it's a moot point, right?
Yeah.
yeah.
So in a way, why not just, I know, the more is less. I keep with the more is less approach. I realize that you have to go through and evaluate them on these, and I understand the administrative part of that. But most of the time, if they're not going to be applicable, then why not? I mean, why not have them there for a safeguard? Because there aren't too many, as we stand, there aren't many places where most of this is going to apply. But who knows where we'll be in 15 years?
Yeah, I think what we keep coming back to with each one I go through is, we need to go through it again to make it easier and make it understandable for the standards that apply to everything versus things that are special.
yes.
And because I think Janelle wants to make sure it's easy for people to understand it, and she's not getting dozens of
this
calls
isn't just
about
about
what this is.
me trying to understand it. It's somebody coming in with a site plan who's trying to do it on their own, and the public understanding it, because sometimes the public sees it in the code and thinks that they have to do all of it, and it doesn't all apply. So I just I like clarity, so.
So maybe we do go through it again after we go through the
Yeah.
details and do a pass of making it more understandable and what's applicable or not applicable.
I just want to say too, though, that I think at this point, any, subdivision is going to be, there's lots of money behind it, and there's no one but professionals. So I think the days of someone coming up with a starter plan on their own to develop are gone, in Lewis, at least east of.
This also applies to commercial, and you can do, like, we've
Got
got
a couple of site plans coming in that are commercial, and
Small businesses.
they're small businesses.
Fall out of this, yeah.
So,
Yeah.
I looking at the holistic, not just, yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. We own a small business, but yeah.
I mean, I still think they're corporations and have
Yeah.
significant funding, given real estate costs in Lewis.
But I guess the question is, as the ones we're going through now, I think are quite clear. I mean, they're clear to me. I can't imagine anyone would be confused by these, so.
Yeah, they're clear, but I think to Charlie's point, right, isn't all of like subsection E something that's kind of easily lifted and put in the environmental chapter? Because it's applicable throughout the city. We're talking about parking lots here and billboards and signs.
Signs.
Yeah.
Right.
But I think what we're saying is, let's continue going through these,
Yeah.
get the feedback on them, and then we can talk about where they, you can look at this in detail and come back with a proposal of what should go where. But,
Get the wording down.
yes,
And then
Yeah.
if it's the right wording, but wrong location, we
yeah,
can.
yeah. And my one question on a half hour after closing is a half hour enough, or should it be 1 hour?
Okay.
Just different businesses take longer to shut down.
So you don't have your staff walking out in the dark?
In dark.
I think that's fair.
Yeah,
That's fair.
exactly. I should say, if they leave earlier, they're going to shut the lights off if they know they have to shut the lights off after closing, so, yeah.
So number 5 is it's this idea of wall packs, and I think they're just less expensive, somewhat glaring lights that could be used. And this one's to say that there are times when they're appropriate to use them, but there's better systems, and you have to prove to the satisfaction of the city that other lighting means aren't acceptable.
If this is just, I don't know, is there any point in having it? I mean, maybe they're just not permitted here because if there's something that is potentially problematic.
Well, I think, again, you got to think about commercial, and sometimes it's a security issue, because I have heard that from a number of commercial, and maybe it's just getting them to just shield it and screen it, because for insurance purposes, they need certain things. So I think there's ways to tweak this to get it to where everybody, to find that balance.
I mean, so I'll talk as a building owner for a minute. We've had to use wall-mounted lighting at the Rollins Center and floodlights to make sure that as people leave the meetings at night, they don't fall,
Yeah.
So, while arguably we could say, well, we're the city, we're not fully subject, we still need to lead by example, so if there may be private entities where.
And maybe that's where we look at the luminaries and other things. Yeah.
Timers and motion detectors and those sorts of things.
Right,
yeah.
right.
So that's 6, that's a good segue into 6. 6 is more, it's actually building on the other concern about they be extinguished within half an hour, that there's certain ways to do that, timers or motion sensors or things where there is activity, and it's kind of getting into the weeds with this on something like this, but it is a standard. So that's the intent of that, is to elaborate what types of cutoffs would you have are appropriate or are recommended for parking areas and pedestrian, and we should probably add bicycling in if we're keeping it. This next one, 7, is about,
Yeah, I think wherever we're thinking about drivers, we should add bicycles.
okay. The next one is about, sometimes I think maybe it's a practice that the glare on a property is handled by vegetative screening, but that's not always the best, because it depends on the vegetative screening. Is it going to be maintained there and kept there? And Sometimes it's not
plant style.
fully opaque at certain times of the year. So it just can't be a way to control glare is what that's saying. Illumination projected into a residential area shall not exceed 0.1/10 of a foot candle, and where the measurements are from. I think a lot of codes already have that. The next one is talking about how high the mounted systems can be, and it says in the second line and third line, they can't be in excess of 20 feet above finished grade. So that's not for street lighting, that's for parking lots and other types of lighting systems. And then it talks about the different types of ways of, or how that's mounted above the ground. The next one's talking about the flags that can be illuminated past midnight or past 11 p.m. Whether or not that, again, I'm pulling things out that other communities have, whether or not we want to call that out or not, it's up to us, the city subcommittee to recommend that.
I'm just thinking, I don't want to get I don't think we want the city getting calls for the code enforcement to go out, because that one's going to be tough to enforce.
I also think a lot of people have isn't the Lewis flag?
Well, on the state flag.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Typically, any of those flags would typically be illuminated.
Yeah, but we've only put United States and state flag, we didn't include our city flag in this.
I'm surprised Nancy and Glenn don't ask for the Steelers flag to be.
Well, I'll have one final look at the final draft before I
We'll
vote
be
on
hanging
it.
some terrible towels out.
Right. I still have mine.
See, I have no idea.
Oh,
I
yeah.
did know that, but I didn't know you were.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, he was.
Yeah.
Disappointed.
I mean, this city is unique in that there's a lot of, the city flag has flown a lot. So, I mean, it's worth adding, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, again, I think this one's leaning itself more to the international section.
I'm not sure this is one I'm not sure we should get into, actually. I think people have other flags that they hang at different times, or, I don't know.
I'm just thinking it's a hot button because you get into political flags.
Yes, exactly. Right.
Well, it's not the flag itself, it's illuminating it past
Right,
a
so,
certain time.
so and that's related to the United States Flag Code. If you fly a flag after dusk, it's supposed to be illuminated.
Okay.
And that's why there are people who feel it's entirely unpatriotic to have a flag
Right.
overnight and not have light dedicated to it.
yes.
It not just a porch
So
light.
maybe we do keep this in here, but do we have the city of Lewis flag too?
Make a special permission for the city of Lewis flag, not because it's required by some other code. You could. I mean, I don't think it runs afoul of any speech issues.
Fine.
Because people sometimes have all the flags.
So, let me just ask the question. So, if I had, 5 flags up, and they're not doubles of the American flag, or, whatever, and the lighting is downward on them. So these are flags that are on my front porch, and I've left my porch light on. I would not be running afoul of this, or would I?
Again, I think
Because people leave their porch light on
I think-
later than 11 o'clock if you know.
some people leave them on all night. So
Yeah.
I'm thinking maybe this is something we don't get into, because I know, like, a lot of neighborhoods, people have, their decorative flag, they change it for the season, and then we get the porch light. Maybe this is something we just don't.
Well, breast cancer month, and they have a,
And then how does this reflect to a subdivision
yeah.
Well,
or a
and
commercial?
And from a practical standpoint, We're not going to go after people who have their flags lit.
Yeah.
Right.
So I
I
think,
think you're right. I think you just leave it alone. Well, I mean, leave the U.S. flag in because that's a separate legislation.
Or not even mention it,
You
because
could, because
because you're just not going to touch
We need to have
it.
it in the
yeah, I
subdivision
just think
code.
we,
Take this one out.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, we've shortened the pages.
There you go. There you go. Making progress.
So I'm leaving, so I won't slow you down anymore. I have an 11 o'clock meeting.
Okay.
The next one was about under canopy, so they think of gas stations and banks. It is required for safety, it's important, but just so it's not blasting out at really horizontal angles.
This looks really good.
Yeah.
cover it if we just say, if we have an illumination standard, so it can't go so far off. So, again, I think a lot of these we need to be covered with, if we have just a standard illumination standard that says this is it, because then you can't go off the property and it's going to be shielded.
Okay.
Just, that's my thought, but let's keep going.
Yeah, the only thing I'd say is it's a balancing act, so certain things you want to have more lighting for safety,
Yeah.
like commercial
I
areas,
thought
so
this was
maybe.
a higher lighting because of the safety and other issues around gas stations.
So maybe when we
So it wouldn't
simplify it, we
be covered by the
break it
others,
down to
yeah.
commercial versus residential, and not get into all the weeds of the details
Yeah,
of.
maybe this one goes in the environmental section.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Okay.
Installation.
Electric can't be above ground, has to be underground for these. Poles,
Interrupt. Charlie, are these things that BPW takes into consideration? Because again, we're really talking about street lights for subdivisions.
Yeah, they will on this, yeah.
So do we need these, do they have standards, or do we need standards?
That's also for commercial, right?
They do have standards, yeah.
But to ask like a larger, broader question, is our job not to set the standards in BPW to follow them?
Not if we don't have regulation over it. A BPW sets the standards.
It'd be the other way
So
around.
that's, yeah.
Or the other way around, okay.
So I think this can just either come out or just reference the BPW standards.
well, is this, I mean, it shouldn't conflict with BPW standards for streetlights, but if someone's got a parking lot with electric mounted on poles, this is saying you can't have electric feeds. They have to be underground for those poles.
Are they still looking for that too?
Underground versus overhead?
Yeah.
Yeah, they look at that. I don't know their electric standards that well, so I think we really need their feedback.
So I think maybe we skip this one and we're gonna confer with BPW to make sure.
So that might apply to the next one too, about they have to be on horizontal poles aimed straight down and.
I'm thinking the entire installation section. Because, yeah, I think what we want to do is make sure we're not duplicating work with BPW.
Right, I think a lot of this is, we do need to look at, when BPW looks at a development, a subdivision, what are they looking for in
Or
terms of
even
their,
commercial development, because they're
Yeah.
gonna look at that too. So,
But the section on residential development, lighting and signage, the location, et cetera, of the lightings, I didn't think BPW was looking at that. I think here we're talking more about design standards as opposed to, does BPW,
for a major subdivision, they look at the poles that street lights are mounted on, and the city has standards for the aesthetics of street lights. So there's already some things in there, but this gets into, at the end of a cul-de-sac and,
yeah, I mean,
different
I
areas.
didn't think BPW got into that, and I thought that was more the purview of this than BPW.
Here's how it goes. When a subdivision comes in, all the electrical stuff is handled by the BPW, not GMB, unfortunately. I mean, I sometimes get involved with coordinating plan processing and stuff like that, and really, I don't even know that they brought in through the years a consultant. I think Bob Barnes and his crew did most of the review because they know, those guys are so experienced, so they did most of the review. Like I said before, there are times where we get a street lighting plan and we require it because it would address like whether a light's needed at a cul-de-sac
Yeah.
or something like
So, and I
that.
think that we can get into, because I've actually seen in many different places, that streetlights are shown on a plan, knowing they're not gonna go in that exact location because the utility provider is going to install them where they determine is best to be located, because that's their control and that's their purview. Typically what we can control is, maybe the number, do we want one, like, there might be an application showing 2 streetlights, is that enough? And I think we can control the style and make sure that it's meeting the luminary standards and the, and like it's downward
Yeah.
shielded and screened and stuff. But I think some of that, because I've dealt with a lot of, they're just gonna they'll build way to the, like the style, but they're gonna place it however they wanna place it, because that's how, and we don't have control over that.
But isn't Lewis BPW a little different than, say a larger utility company? Like, don't they work more cooperatively with us and, no, I'm just going to say because as an elected board from, Lewis.
So they have
Yeah.
control over that.
Yeah.
So I think we need to look at what their requirement, because we can't, I don't think we have the ability to tell them what to do. I think we can say, these are the numbers and this is the style and this is how, the lumens and stuff. But I think some of the other stuff, I'm not sure we have as much control over because it's not a city utility.
Right, we don't have exclusivity over it, but when we do have a liaison to the Planning Commission from BPW, and there is supposed to be a cooperative, interaction there, but ultimately, as Janelle says, and Charlie, it's BPW's purview.
I wonder if, with the next draft of this, if we shouldn't send it to Tom Panetta, who's our
That's what I was
liaison,
wondering.
We're actually meeting
and
with
Or invite Tom.
us and
then,
this afternoon.
send it to him, then invite him to our next meeting.
I was thinking that
Provide
too.
any feedback or thoughts from
We're
BPW.
actually meeting with BPW this afternoon to discuss all of this.
And actually, then I have a question. I'm on here and I'm looking at what looks like it's like a 96-page document that talks about the wiring and all of this, and it's the Lewis BPW electric tariff is what it's titled, but it's 96 pages of, it's like a code doc that I found here. But it says effective 2004, so it would be interesting to see when they have last updated their aesthetic standards, and if it was 2000.
We can control the aesthetics. What type of, do we want the old gas lit kind of looking? Is the base black or silver or whatever? We can control that. What we can't control is the exact placement and how it's installed and how that pole functions.
But we can control the directionality of the light,
Yes.
the spread of the light, all the LED here.
Yes.
And, I'm looking at, I am starting to think, though, that we repeat many times the directionality issue under each section, and if there isn't a way we can
Right, yeah.
Yep. Just make it once.
skinny this down.
Yeah, but all of it,
Yeah.
it needs to
Yeah.
be a narrow,
Like,
Yeah.
Concise.
Yeah.
We'll work on, I know exactly, downward screen.
downward screened, and it does seem just,
The lumens, certain places need to go out, certain
Yeah,
places need
yeah.
to stay.
or, we're talking about those banks of lights, like perhaps that's something that is, instead of, to me, the wording seemed reversed. Instead of making it that it had to, how was this stated? It was stated like, to me, backwards in a way.
Yeah.
Unless the city found issue with it or something like that, like perhaps it should be considered last.
Yep.
And
we're gonna
Yeah.
power through this. and
Okay,
we're
okay.
taking notes, We're gonna
Okay,
rewrite this one.
so
and
if we get on to recreational uses, my concern there was with number 2, where we say recreational facilities for basketball, baseball, football, soccer, miniature golf, tennis, or track shall not be illuminated if located within a residential district or sited on a non-residential property located within 1,000 feet of a property containing a residential use. And I'm specifically thinking of the tennis courts, basketball courts, and Canal Front Park.
Yeah, I would like to maybe lose some of this, because really what we're talking about, a lot of it is going to be city parks and city amenities, because there's not too many subdivisions that actually have all of this, and I don't see a golf course coming into the city of Lewis.
Mini golf, too.
Mini golf, Mike.
How about a racetrack?
Mini golf, and we better add pickleball.
Yeah.
So, I actually,
You know I'm right on that one.
That was my next note. was to get rid of pickleball.
That pickleball.
yeah, I would rather like kind of remove this, because most of these are gonna fall under, they're gonna end up in city parks, or they're in existing city parks.
How about unless it's in a city park, or,
Yeah, and again, I think this one maybe moves to the environmental section.
Yeah, I'd say that this is, in communities I work with, it's more where there's athletic fields and school stadiums and things.
Yeah.
That, you know, the 1,000 feet is where that comes in. It would never work in a place like Lewis, 1,000 feet.
Yeah.
But I do understand that we don't want to create something that is impeding parks. That, I mean, it should, the parks lighting should be taken into consideration, but hopefully that's being done by the city Parks and Recreation when they design things. So again, I'm just putting things in here, and I'm happy to adjust things or take things.
and I think also you also have to, if someone buys near a city park, they're accepting certain amounts of use, and, you know, that's kind of, you're accepting a risk, or just a use that's there by purchasing across from a city park.
I kind of question if we shouldn't just delete the whole recreational
This
uses.
section.
Keep the pickleball.
What?
I said, but keep the
Keep the
pickleball.
pick- yeah.
That kind of makes
And,
sense.
I mean, I think we have things, if it's a commercial use, like a mini golf that's a commercial, it would come under the commercial stuff earlier. And otherwise, it's going to be in a city park where the city would be.
Okay.
Yeah, we definitely, I guess, should have that in commercial, so this will be in commercial.
Yeah.
We jump down to that. Is there anything, there was something about on-lot lighting with subdivisions less than 4,000 square. Is there any concerns about that?
Where are you?
I remember seeing this.
Page 10, the bottom, and then the top of page 11.
Okay.
It's-
Yes.
And I'm not
If
sure.
we're talking about on-lot lighting, I don't want to get into, because again, this is where we were talking, this cannot be, this should, as we were talking earlier, if you're talking about on-lot lighting, you're talking about a house lighting.
Yeah, it should go in the,
That needs to come out.
out of
because
subdivision and into.
Otherwise, we're only getting the new stuff and not everything else that exists.
But I think this is something we really want to have sent over to that
To
area.
environmental.
Yeah. Yes, to environmental, yeah. It's not that we're saying we shouldn't be talking about this or putting this in somewhere.
just
It's
doesn't make-
it's the wrong spot for it, yeah.
Who enforces that, Robin?
Yeah, you
Yeah.
could enforce
Whatever,
it,
yeah, okay.
which is, yeah, we'd have to figure that one out, because that gets tricky.
Yep,
Enforcement is always tricky.
gotcha.
The next section is really talking about submitting plans and what's in a lighting plan, which I don't know that we have. If you look in here, everything that's underlined is new, so there's not much that's in our current code that
I
we
mean, if
talk about with
when
it.
we add information about lighting, I think we need to require something in the plan, otherwise there's no way to assess it, so.
Yeah, and Charlie, I mean, I know because the checklist has a lighting plan in there. And it goes for final plan, it goes to basically the city engineer and BPW to review.
Yeah, I think this just, like we were talking, these get moved to preliminary and final plan requirements. and not part of the standards.
Okay.
Because, just so everybody knows, it's like,
Yeah.
we've got, there's gonna be a section that says, this is what's required for the preliminary plan, and this is what's required for final, and this is where this section makes more sense.
And I think we have to make sure that in this, where we have the checklist, that we've added the right words in the checklist around this for the lighting plan.
Yeah, and I think what we can always do is lighting and per the code citation. The checklist 7 pages at the moment.
Yeah.
So,
Now, the street lighting dedication, that all looked reasonable to me. Did people have any comments on that?
that's a Charlie question.
It is? Is it?
Page 13.
Page 13, street
Okay.
lighting dedication.
And that might be part of the final plan submission too, because a lot of the improvements, and this is an improvement, there's dedication of that.
Yeah.
And is this needed, or is this already covered as we're accepting the streets? Because it's gonna be within the right-of-way, so is this needed if it's part of what the city's accepting as part of the right-of-way?
I know that
So I'm just,
it is part of what is bonded by the developers.
Yeah.
So I feel like once we accept the development, that everything that's been bonded
bonded is,
has been accepted.
okay. So we'll figure out if this is needed or not.
If the dedication's needed.
Yeah, I think this is like, well, at least in the existing code, we have the post-city council approval, the construction section
Yeah.
of the code, and that's sort of where this would belong, I
Yeah,
think.
I think this goes into how to close out a subdivision and the bonding process.
Yeah.
And that's even if it's needed, because I think we can just make it a very generic, if it's in the right of way, it needs to be bonded. And, because that's gonna go for trees, street lights, the curbing, the paving, everything. gets
Yeah, I mean,
bonded.
everything,
So-
even the sewer and the water gets
Yeah,
dedicated
everything.
over to the board,
Yep,
so.
yeah, so,
So did you say that your example of a street light where a tree kind of grew up around it, that can't happen now because there is some placement issues?
Yeah, I sent that to you a couple of weeks ago, but it just has to be coordinated between Parks and Rec as to where they want street trees versus, I'm guessing utilities and the street lights will be there first, but it's just a matter of whoever is planting the street trees, use a little bit of common sense and not plant them near where a street pole is. I mean, it's just,
Yeah, I think part of this comes back to what we were talking about earlier, that when the utility comes in to put the poles, they may not be precisely following the plan for when the plan was approved of where they thought lighting poles would go. So then those go in, and then you have a landscaping plan that was developed thinking the poles were going to be somewhere else, but people come in and follow the landscaping plan, and then you end up with two right next to each other. So I think we have to,
utilities should be at least 5 feet away from each other, especially for underground. So I think, if we see that happen, typically, we've got inspectors on the site, so to make sure, it's like, don't plant a tree around, or don't put the,
Yeah.
I think that was.
it's easier moving the trees.
Phenomenal.
yeah, it's much easier, yeah. Well, it's easier planting them not next to it in the first place, but,
Yes.
I think on the final plan, it does say that improvements should be identified, including street trees.
Yes, we do require a final landscape plan. It's just, again, when the electric utilities go out and install the streetlights, they're not always in the exact location as shown.
okay, we're at 11:20, we need to stop, a hard stop at 11:30. We haven't gotten through landscaping. But first of all, is there anything else on lighting?
I just noticed in one section that we took out, there was, the last sentence said something about signage.
In a residential?
Yeah.
Yeah. And it was lighting for some.
Under on-lot lighting, number 3, page 10, but actually it ends up on page 11. B, signage in subdivisions, all signage in the subdivision shall be of a consistent style throughout the subdivision. if we're removing that or putting it into the environmental section, is that okay, or do we
Well,
want something?
that actually is covered in the signage.
Yeah, so there's a
So
whole other,
the code already recognizes that in the signage, so that just comes out.
okay.
Because signage is actually in zoning and not in the subdivision code.
Okay.
Okay. Landscaping. Have folks read over the landscaping section, and are there any high-level comments or specific ones you want to make right now? My one comment was on page 15, whether we need to say something about the plants being rated for our zone. I mean, I was surprised that in the past we've reviewed landscaping plans, and one of the comments was that the species actually, wasn't rated for our zone and likely wouldn't survive, so.
Yeah, so I think two is that, I think we should put native and
Non-invasive species,
Covers a lot.
and that usually covers top of page 15 under B2. So
I thought we had native and non-invasive in here somewhere.
To answer your question, Nancy, it talks about the selections of landscaping, and there's a reference in there that is updated regularly. This is my understanding.
Yeah.
And I think it would address some of the selections that are no longer, in this zone. But I do think that this entire section, at some point, needs to be run through Parks and Recreation, because
Yes.
they have
And
people.
I've had that conversation with the Parks and Recreation administrator, marina administrator, and we're going to be working on meeting and getting this in front of them sooner, because they're the ones who really review the landscaping and have control over the landscaping for subdivisions.
What we were trying to do here is add in more on landscaping. Some of it's in there, the things that are not underlined are already in our code, but there's not much of it, is to add more detail, just like with lighting for a landscaping plan. We're asking for a landscaping plan, but it's kind of, we're thinking of what it needs to have in there, or we're reacting to a developer who comes in and doesn't have things or enough. So a lot of our screening buffers, it's kind of complicated because it deals not with just landscaping, but street trees and buffers, the other things that we've talked about in other sections of our ordinance.
I just wonder if we shouldn't see if Parks and Rec would like to send, a subcommittee to join this meeting,
Yeah,
and
we
our
would-
next meeting.
Going to try and meet with them individually and get their thoughts, and then get comments back. The Parks and Marina Administrator and I have been talking about the best way to get this to the Parks and Rec Commission and get comments back.
I mean, at some point, I think it might be good for us to talk directly with them.
Yeah.
Just because, my experience on the LPC is that quite often we're looking at things, there tend to be a lot of comments on landscaping, and it's already been reviewed by Parks and Rec, so somehow we need to be on the
Same page.
on the same page.
Gotcha.
Yeah, totally agree with you on that.
Yeah, and I think that, there are some people on the LPC, like Melanie, who's, I think, quite expert at that and has a lot of background knowledge. Like myself, I would not put myself on that committee.
Yeah, I just hate to
Yeah,
change.
I don't think we're going to create a subcommittee of a subcommittee. I think, again, we're going to be meeting with the arborist and getting some of their feedback, and
I guess
then-
my point is, it sounds like you're meeting in terms of the
City representatives or employees meeting together, but in the end, it's that committee
Oh, no,
makes the
no,
decision.
we're gonna-
This committee that,
no,
so-
we were going to meet with members of the committee.
Okay,
Yeah, no, we weren't going to ignore, no, we were going to meet with members of the committee.
okay.
Yep.
Can you let me know when that's happening, and I'll try to join, just so we have some...
I will do my best to remember.
I mean, I'm not an arborist, but...
You were at least a gardener. You did more than I had.
I'm just going to throw it out there because it seems like an appropriate time is we've got to be careful when we're talking about changing the landscaping is not the right word, the vegetation involved with stormwater management facilities, and that's already been approved at a state
Correct.
level.
And that has actually gone through the review and approval by that agency. So they've determined whether or not that is appropriate or not. So just keep that in mind.
I didn't see, did you see anything in here where you thought we were really dealing with vegetation and stormwater?
No, it's come up in meetings.
Yeah, it's kind of come up on several
Are
projects.
you saying like within a basin or adjacent to a
No,
basin?
in the,
Inside it.
Inside it, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that wasn't the intent to get to the.
Yeah, I know, but I just, like I said, I didn't know if it was the right forum to bring it up, but I know it's come up a couple times, you just gotta be careful about doing that.
The other group, I think, in the city is the Historic Byway Committee. They're not a city committee, but they are involved in landscaping along, and it does talk about corridor
and
buffers in
again,
here.
that actually falls on, because the enforcement authority actually comes through DelDOT, and we do send applications to them, or we notify them, so they can meet with the applicant ahead of time and address any concerns.
Yeah.
I don't want that in code about the byways, because they're not a state agency. It's the enforcement authority actually comes through DelDOT, and that can get, so I just want to keep it clean.
And there's a recommendation.
Correct?
Yeah.
And it's just a recommendation, and again, the enforcement comes through DelDOT. So if DelDOT wants something done on behalf of the byway, they work with DelDOT to make sure that the plans are referenced and do that. But we know, they're like a consulting advisory group.
Yeah,
Because they do a great work, and I want to make sure.
Okay, I'm looking
yeah.
at the time, sorry to cut you off. I'm
No,
looking
that's
at the
okay.
time, and if you,
It actually is 11:29, that is slow.
oh, okay.
Just an FYI, that clock is always slow.
I want to nail down what we're going to have for our next meeting.
So by our next meeting, will we have the street section?
That's my goal, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And if everyone could review it and have their comments ready on the streets then. And at the next meeting, we'll hear back on what discussion has occurred with Karen Bennett at State Parks on kind of wildlife and light, and comments from RMD, and comments from Parks and Rec. Now, at our next meeting, we'll hear those, and then we want to get through the checklist, which I think should be fairly simple, because it's simply a list of everything that comes out of the changes we've made that should be submitted. So if people can review that before the next meeting and be ready with comments and send them to Tom in advance if you have any things that you think need to be addressed on these lists.
And I urge people to look at 17020 where it references these to make sure it makes sense. And Charlie, the things on final plan, which is on page 5 of this, I'm really looking for your insights, because I don't deal with it as much or haven't dealt with it as much, and I know that, the improvement construction plan, that's where I really just took a lot of what's in our current code and put it into this checklist.
Okay.
But I know as you're going through streets and things that it's liable to change, so your insights will be really valuable for that part.
Now, the only other two things I see left on the list, and tell me if I'm missing anything, are the open space, the grading plan, and then, three things, and then a review of the definitions. Is there anything else I'm missing?
Not that I can think of.
Can we have the open space by the next meeting?
That'll be my target.
Okay.
I'm going to say no, because our next meeting's October 6th, and the definition of open space, I'm still trying to get the annexation zone subcommittee together.
I would be happy to speak to the annexation subcommittee Annexation Zone Subcommittee to see if they wouldn't be happy with this group moving ahead with that open
Okay,
space
and I did
definition.
forward all the information to Tom,
Because-
so he has that, because I just haven't been able to get a date together.
Yeah. So I think we should move ahead with,
Yeah,
we'll
I
check
think
in
maybe
with them and make sure that is copacetic with them, so. We good?
Yeah.
Okay. And for our next meeting on October 6th, can we make it a longer meeting and try, I'm desperate to actually get through everything that we have drafted and get our comments down. Joe, do you have any final comments, and would you be able on October 6th to attend a,
Yeah, I think we left that one till noon.
And I think we even said maybe
I'm
it's a
good
little
for
bit
October
longer.
6th, and I have comments for Charlie on the 3 utility items he sent out, but I'll be sending them through him, through email.
Okay.
okay, great. Our October 6th meeting is starting at 10:30.
Yes.
Would people be able to go until 1:30?
Yes.
I'll pack a lunch.
Okay. And I will be remote for that one because I'll be out of town, but,
Does that work for you, Tom?
Yeah, I was going to say, I'll be remote too.
Okay.
But just
Glenn
because of other.
and Charlie, are you guys?
Good going that late?
I've got to be at the Public Service Commission at 1, but I'm not as critical as the rest of you, so. it's all good.
Should we do this remote, I'm wondering? Joe, will you be
I
attending in
need to have
person?
somebody
In the room.
physically here.
Okay.
So
I can
one or
physically
two
be there.
members need to be here.
Charlie and I will be bringing lunch.
Okay. So you can be here physically? Deborah?
Yeah, I can be here physically.
What are you thinking, Deborah?
I was probably just gonna bring a yogurt and an energy bar, but
So Anne Marie just texted me she needs the Zoom account, so we need to wrap up. Anne Marie's about ready to start another meeting with us.
Okay,
so
motion to close the meeting?
I'll make a motion to close the meeting.
seconded by Joe?
Second.
Closed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Meeting adjourned.
Thank you.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Thanks for your attention to that. It's not the easiest stuff to go through. And I will send that article, Deborah, to you, or anybody else who
Yeah, is it in